Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of my podcast, where today's episode is going to be focusing on the rise of the United States men's national team, essentially the team that represents the United States at men's international level in competitions such as the World Cup or local tournaments such as the World Cup or in some instances Copa America. I'll take a close look at what were exactly the events that led to the rise of the US. We'll highlight some of the good performances they had in these recent years. We'll also discuss some notable differences between the US men's team back then till now. We'll take a look at some key aspects that helped contribute to the rise of the US. And lastly, we'll look at some problems that still exist that need to be fixed if the US is going to be serious about this rise that they've had. So tune in, grab your popcorn, and hope you enjoyed today's episode. So, first off, we'll do some background of what the US looked like throughout history in regards to the sport of soccer. So, soccer in the US wasn't necessarily always the most interested sport or the most viewed sport. There's obviously other sports that fans in the US would rather um, watch or be fans of, such as American football, basketball, baseball, and even hockey. All of those sports have more interest from the general American public, and they would much rather spend their time being fans of teams of those sports and watching those sports over soccer. However, having that in mind, that didn't mean soccer didn't exist. Obviously, it existed in the US. The US had a national team, but it wasn't anything special or significant. It was never near top tier level teams. Of course, I think the fanaticism of the sport at the end of the day is very crucial to a team's success. So the US not Americans not having that much interest in soccer wasn't going to generate the team to be successful at that time. Some achievements to note that the US did throughout its history was they achieved a third place in the first 1930 World Cup, which obviously the level of that the sport had offered back then to now was vastly different. It was almost 100 years ago, but it's in the record books. It's going to be remembered. It's going to be talked about when we mention World Cup history. It's the US is the only team in North America that has gone that far in the competition. So essentially, in terms of World Cup history, they're the most successful North American team in the World Cup. But even then, without having the rise that happened now, the US in more modern years, modern decades, I guess you could say, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, they've managed to cement themselves as the second best team in North America, right behind Mexico. They've been they've competed well against Mexico. They've gone toe to toe with them, given them good games, even in some instances beaten Mexico. And Mexico is arguably the best team in the North American region, the most successful one, the one that wins the most titles, the one that's most in the World Cup. But the US, despite in those eras coming second to Mexico, they've done pretty well being in that realm with them. They've won important Gold Cup finals, and the Gold Cup is the local tournament in North America. They've beaten Mexico in some finals, and the most notable matchup between Mexico and the US happened in 2002 World Cup in the round of 16 knockout game. This match was between Mexico and the US, and Mexico was the heavy favorites to win this game, but the US produced the upset, and they managed to beat Mexico 2-0 and against all odds advance. And that was probably one of the more remembered moments of the United States early history prior to the rise. And this constant mention of Mexico has to do with the fact that in North America, in international regards to North America, the biggest rivalry in the region and one of the best and most intense rivalries in the world is between the U.S. men's national team and the Mexican national team. Their matchups always led to some intense matchups. Some certain controversies in and out the field have happened. And it's a rivalry that has only gotten much more intense with this rise. The rivalry was already strong enough back then when US wasn't taking the sport seriously, and now that it's gotten seriously, the rivalry has only gotten way more intense. So now we'll get into the actual events that mostly contributed to the rise of the US. First, we'll get to the 2018 World Cup. Shockingly, the US did not qualify for this World Cup, which was a big failure for the US back then because this in North America, the world of soccer isn't fully developed. The only nations that really play at a high level, I guess you could say, are Mexico, the US, and maybe certain Central American countries such as Panama or Costa Rica. And the US failed to qualify in qualifiers where they had to play smaller scale teams that don't necessarily have the best national teams, where their players don't play necessarily at a high level. I mean, the US was literally knocked out by Trinidad and Tobago, a country that doesn't really prioritize soccer in their nation. And even though the US doesn't necessarily prioritize soccer either, the US is arguably better than Trinidad and Tobago and many Caribbean national teams. But yet, they knocked out the US, and it was a big failure back then. And for the Soccer Federation of the United States, this was a clear sign that there had to be some change if the US was going to get serious about the sport, because failing qualifying to a World Cup in a region where it's arguably easy to qualify, especially with a team with a big gap in talent, such as the US, compared to other teams in the region, it was a massive failure and something had to be done for there to be a change. However, the change didn't happen overnight. Obviously, there had to be some time to take place for actual change to begin. Because 1 year later, in 2019, the local Gold Cup took place. And the US was able to reach a final, which was expected of them. And meeting them in the final was Mexico, their arch rivals. And so for the US, it was an obligation to win this title. But unfortunately for them, that didn't happen. They lost. And for them, this was another step back in their process towards getting better. But the good thing for them is that in that team in which they lost that final, they had a lot of young talent, which gave fans some hope that in the upcoming years, their players could be at a top level and essentially basically be able to do something special with the national team. And those fans were right, because a bunch of good performances would soon become with the rise of that young talent. For example, there was a period from 2021 to now where there's been massively good performances by the US, which you could label as the start of this rise. For instance, in 2021, another competition that takes place in the region, in the North American region, is referred to the Nations League, which is similarly to its European counterpart, where it's a friendly tournament, but it is official by FIFA and the confederations, and it is an official title at the end of the day. But the point to note here is that the US reached to the final against Mexico, basically a rematch of the 2019 Gold Cup final. And they did have a lot of young players playing. And many of that young talent was already in Europe playing at a high level. So the US had basically a different energy, something new to offer against that match with Mexico, because arguably the US had probably the better players against Mexico in that matchup, but at the end of the day, they still had to go win it. And that was one of the way more intense games we've seen throughout the entirety of this rivalry between the US and Mexico, because this match started off by Mexico winning and by Mexico scoring in literally the first minute of the game. And then a couple minutes afterwards, like 20 minutes afterwards, Mexico scored a second goal, but it was disallowed for an offside. Then, not that long after, the US equalizes by a young talent, Giovanni Reina, only 18 years old at the time, which is very astonishing. An 18-year-old scoring for their country at at a high level in a final against your arch rivals, that was just something that's really to admire, that a young player doing that at that age. But anyways, Giovanni Reina scores. Then around the 79th minute, only 10 minutes left to be played, Mexico scores the second one. And it seems that Mexico is going to take the title, that they're going to take the win. However, 2 minutes later, one of the US team's more experienced players, Weston McKinney, scores the second goal and has the game all tied. So the game ends. It's a tie 2-2, which means we have extra time, 30 minutes. Then out of nowhere, penalty in favor of the US. The US captain, Christian Pulisic, scores the third goal from the penalty spot. At the moment, the US are winning 3-2. And then, 2 minutes before extra time ends, a penalty, but now in favor of Mexico. And so Mexico's veteran captain, Andres Guardado, steps up to take it. And he's a really good penalty taker. Probably missed only a few in the entirety of his career. He steps up to take it. And mind you, the US was not playing with its main goalkeeper. The goalkeeper, Zach Steffen, got injured throughout regular time in that match. And so they had to use a substitute goalkeeper who has never started for the US, not even in friendlies, which meant he had to make his debut in this intense level of a match. And for the most part, he did pretty well. He made very key crucial save that denied Mexico from winning, but the moment was now. If he wanted to make a name for himself for the US, it had to be now. He had to step up, and he did. Guardado stepped up to take the pen, but young Ethan Horvath, saved the pen and gave the US the win. And this was a statement for this young team to make, and a statement for the US as a whole to be like, we're here, we want to make history, times are changing. And this was the start of the new US team. But the victory against Mexico wouldn't stop there. 2 months later, the another edition of the Gold Cup took place. And this is very interesting to note because none of the main players, so the young talent that played in Europe, didn't take part in this team. The squad, the US squad that took place in this tournament was filled with a bunch of MLS players, which was the local league where the United States plays at. And essentially, players from the local league were the ones that made up the squad for the World Cup. And many of them weren't, no one was really expecting the US to get to a semifinal, let alone a final. They had other teams back to win, such as Jamaica or Mexico, but they did reach the final. And once they reached the final, most would assume that Mexico was going to win, given that Mexico did bring their full A team and their best players for this tournament. But when the match took place, that difference was not seen on the pitch. The match was 50-50. Both chances had really, really good chances to score throughout the entirety of 90 minutes. Both the US and Mexico had their chances that they missed, unfortunately, for both sides. But this was already a big statement for this US team because their C and B squad was going toe to toe against Mexico's A team. They were doing really, really well. But at the end of the 90 minutes, a tie, heading into the extra time, the 30 minutes. And in the second half of extra time, the US, Miles Robinson, the Atlanta United defender, scored the goal to give the US the win. And now, boom, just like that, Mexico has won 2 back-to-back finals, back-to-back CONCACAF titles against their arch rivals, Mexico. And that has never been done before. If I'm not mistaken, the US has never won back-to-back titles like that against Mexico in their history. But history is going to be rewritten at some point. There's a first time for everything. And so the US made that statement that summer of 2021. And after they won those titles, they focused on qualifying for the 2022 World Cup, where now they had to qualify. Given that the last World Cup cycle they failed to qualify, now they had to. It was a given for them, especially after the good summer they had. It was a must. And for the most part, they did pretty well. They qualified, which was the main thing. However, there was a few underperformances that happened, which shouldn't have happened, such as the loss against Panama one loss against Canada, another one against Costa Rica. But the main highlight was they got their third win over Mexico. And this was important to note because throughout the history of this rivalry, neither one of the two teams had gone had won three back-to-back matches against the other, but the US made history and was the first team in the rivalry to do so in November of that year, 2021, as the US beat Mexico 2-0 in Columbus, Ohio, which was probably their biggest win in qualifying. And that was and those victories and their performances in that cycle were enough to send them to the World Cup, I should say. And we saw more of this rise at the World Cup because they were the only team in North America that qualified out of the group stages. Canada, they went out in the first round, so did Costa Rica and Mexico, shockingly. But the US was the only team that went through to the next round. And their opponents in the first round of the knockout stages was the Netherlands. And many people predicted for the US to even cause an upset. But that didn't happen. The US had the Netherlands had way many better players, better quality up front, better goalkeeper, better midfield, and better defense. And the US literally did nothing in that match. The Netherlands just essentially toyed with the US and they won 3-1, sending the US home. But the main thing was that the US got this far in the World Cup and were the only team in North America to do so, meaning they were headed towards a right direction. And also another important thing to note was in the group stages, the US played a massively good game against England, which was the rivals in the group stages. And obviously England has a way better team, way better quality players, the better stars. But the US outplayed them in that match. That match ended as a 0-0 draw. US had some moments where they were even better than England and looked like the better team that had a chance to score, but it didn't happen, unfortunately, for them. But standing toe to toe against one of the World Cup favorites, one of the best teams in the world, was something remarkable and one of the highlights of that World Cup, showcasing the growth of the US. I interrupt the show to bring the trivia portion of the podcast. So this portion consists of me asking 3 questions regarding to the topic of the episode. And the first person that comments 3 correct answers to the questions will get a like on their comment, a comment back from the channel, and a subscription to their YouTube accounts. So the first question: how many titles does the United States men's national team have? Next question: how many World Cups has the USA men's national team qualified for? Final question: which player has the most appearances for the United States men's national team? Once again, the first person that comments all the 3 correct answers to the 3 questions will get a like on their comment, a comment back from the channel, and a subscription back to their YouTube account. Thank you for participating in this trivia, and we'll get right back to the show. But now we look at what are some of the key distinctions that the US from 2021 to now had in comparison to previous generations. What are these differences in the first place? Well, first off is that back then the US would have one, at the very most, 2 or 3 key players playing in Europe. And obviously, in the world of soccer, if a player wants to be the best they can truly be, they're going to have to play in Europe, and more specifically in top 5 leagues such as in England, Spain, France, Italy, and Germany. They're gonna have to play in a team in those leagues if they truly want to transcend and do really good in this sport. And back then they would only have like at least 3 players, at most 3. And now literally the US could have a whole entire 11 that plays in Europe. And most of those players would be playing for top leagues in Italy or England. That's how much the US has improved, how much their talent has improved. The whole starting 11 can literally be from players that play in Europe. That's one of the key differences and why the US has excelled so much these last few years, because their quality has gotten massively better. And it's also important to note that all these players are relatively young. They're not even in their primes and they're doing so well, which means they have a lot of time to get even better and, you know, excel more than they already have for the national team. And again, it's different to what previous US teams had in other generations because many of the players were to be experienced players in their primes or past their primes, not even playing in Europe. And given what the US players are now, it's way different compared to what it was back then. But also, the US, for I guess you could say the first time, they've gotten uh, an elite top level coach in Mauricio Pochettino. And this coach has managed top teams throughout his career, such as Tottenham and Chelsea, English giants. He's also managed PSG with the likes of the best player in the world, Lionel Messi, and talents Neymar and Kylian Mbappe. He's managed such players and teams of that high level, which means he could carry what he knows and what he's learned and what he's managed and all those stints over to the US, which can be a good thing for them having a coach of that caliber managing this team should give the US fans hope that they could do something in the coming years, even in the World Cup. They might be able to do an underdog performance and go far, given that the US is hosting a tournament at home and having players with this type of caliber and this talent and a top elite level coach. That's really, really great looking forward to. And the US has never had a coach of this caliber managing them. And now that they do, it could be a really good thing for them. And I think another notable difference from back then to now that contributed to the rise has to be that there has been increase in the last few years in culture around the country. And I do think a large part of it is the US's good performances and the rise. Because as I mentioned already before earlier in the show, that soccer was not necessarily the most popular sport in the country. Other sports are preferred by Americans. However, in the last few years, there has been a massive increase in fans being interested in the sport of soccer, not just with the national team, just soccer in general. We've gotten more people invested in the local league and the MLS. More fans are supporting their local teams. We've gotten also fans being attentive towards other leagues around the world, such as the Premier League in England or La Liga in Spain. There's been a great increase of viewership in the US towards the sport of soccer. And I remember around 2022, there was a statistic that really impressed me because a few years ago, the top five sports were number one, American football, number two, basketball, number three, baseball, number four, hockey, and number five, soccer. However, soccer was able to overtake in 2022 hockey, which meant that soccer was now the fourth most viewed and cared about sport in the US. And I also heard a statistics saying that if everything goes well in the World Cup, in the next edition of the World Cup, and many Americans go to these matches, and they might just overtake baseball and basically be in the big top three of most viewed sports in the US, which I wouldn't find crazy at the slightest, given that the interest in soccer has grown in the US in the last few years, which is very important, I think, for an increase in the US doing well. Because I think having the fans behind their back is gonna motivate the US players no matter what, having their fans supporting them at home. So on to the next talking point is the development that US players have now. So part of the increase with the rise of the US has to do with the the development of players in the US system. So many of them come from academies and from MLS clubs, from MLS teams. They produce talent and at a young age they ship them off to Europe to teams like in Germany or in England where players get developed and increase their football skills and talents. Some of these notable players have been Christian Pulisic, who arguably I would say is the best player in the U.S. history now. Weston McKennie, who's been a regular starter for Italian club Juventus for the last 5 years. Giovanni Reina, a young American prodigy playing in Borussia Dortmund. And a few other names such as a Brendan Aronson or Timothy Weah, players like that have excelled and done well in the European clubs. Some of them have been consistent and stayed in their teams and have been key figures to their team's success, while others have gotten experience, shipped off to other clubs in Europe that's gotten them to play in other systems, develop, and gotten better, which they obviously translate over to the national team. And this player development is a key aspect for why the US is so well now. The captain and the best player, Christian Pulisic, as I mentioned, he started off playing for Borussia Dortmund, was then moved to Chelsea in 2019, and he became their best player in the 2019-2020 season. He carried Chelsea on their back, and in the 2020-2021 season, he was an important figure for their Champions League title, which they won. That was the second title that Chelsea won in the Champions League, and Pulisic was a key figure for Chelsea winning that title. For an American doing that was astonishing for U.S. history. In regard to the sport, I would even say that in North America, the U.S. has definitely the best starting 11 and the best quality players out of all the national teams. In the region, I think Mexico, for the longest, Mexico was the team that had the best players and they played at the best club. But in recent years, Mexico has had a decline as well. And I think Mexico having their decline and US having their rise also contributed to the success that the US has now. Because, for example, many of Mexico's starting 11 players, they play in local league, in Mexico's local league, and many of their top five players that play in Europe don't necessarily play in the biggest clubs. They play in more smaller scale teams and smaller scale leagues. They have like one or two players playing at a top level, whereas the US, they have way more amounts of players playing at a top level. And I think part of this is the rise of the local league, the MLS. MLS academies, as I already mentioned, are doing a really good job at finding talent and exporting them to Europe to play in top leagues. There's been an increase in attendances in MLS. More fans are interested in supporting their MLS teams. Even attendances, sometimes I look at some of the teams, the support that they have in their stadiums, and with teams such as Charlotte FC or LAFC, sometimes I see the ambient and the atmosphere that the fans of those clubs produces, and I'm surprised because sometimes to me they kind of have some similarities to the European atmospheres. Obviously, they're not the same, but the US is making and US fans are making an effort to truly improve. And to me, I find it interesting to know because many times Europeans, in regards to soccer, they look down upon the US. So whenever they see the US atmospheres or the US soccer culture, they laugh at it or say that it's too cringe or whatnot. But as an American myself, I don't necessarily would agree with the comments that Europeans have to say about US soccer. I would say that the Europeans, they are obviously in another league. They're far superior in terms of culture and atmosphere than US, but I feel the US is making that effort to get better, and I think they're doing a good job at improving. And I admire the passion that many of these fans have for their own clubs, which does contribute to the rise of the local league. But not only does it help with the exportation of their players, they are competing in the local club tournaments. So, for example, the Champions League counterpart in North America to the European version is the CONCACAF Champions Cup, which is essentially the Champions League in North America, where clubs of pretty much every North American country competes. We got clubs from the Caribbean islands, we got Central American teams, Mexican teams, Canadian, and obviously MLS teams representing American teams in this competition. And the US clubs have never won this tournament. I think there was a 16-year dominance of Mexican teams where a Mexican club would win it back to back to back to back for 16 straight years. And then all of a sudden, in 2022, out of nowhere, against all odds, an MLS team was able to win this title for the first time in MLS history. They were the first American and MLS team to do so, which was the Seattle Sounders. They beat Pumas Unam of Liga MX. They also eliminated a few other Mexican clubs along the way, like Club Leon, and made a statement that not only was the U.S. rising and getting better in the national teams, they were also getting better in the local league. The MLS league was getting way better, and it was shown here now that teams were actually winning the competition. Because back then, you could say around 2010, maybe even 2011, MLS teams did really nothing to compete against the Mexican squads. The Mexican teams would even send their B team players to play this tournament, and Mexican clubs would give it very little importance to this tournament because they had no one to compete against. Literally, the Mexican teams' best opponents were themselves. The other Mexican teams in those tournaments would be their own rivals because the MLS teams, MLS clubs would have nothing to offer. But now, obviously, that's changed. MLS has improved dramatically over the last few years, and to the point where they started winning. So they last won their title in 2022. However, in the 2023 and 2024 edition, um, they could have MLS teams. The farthest they got was a final. They ended up losing to a Mexican team. In the 2023 version, LAFC lost to Club Leon, and in 2024, the Columbus Crew lost against Pachuca, which yes, it might not necessarily be the best thing to happen at MLS. It at least shows that they are competing and that they are getting more farther in these tournaments than they would in previous editions, and they won it. Obviously, I do think an MLS club would win one again in the future, but in some instances, the Mexican teams will probably win some of these editions as well. And looking at how much MLS has been improving, it benefits the national team massively because of the talent that will be produced and the new culture that's stated for the US. And even with MLS, it was predicted that MLS is trying to be the best league in the Americas and trying to rival those of Europe. Right now, they're not at that level, but I do think in a few years they might get to that level and probably be a good rival to the European leagues, where top tier level players in their prime would maybe want to come here because a lot of right now we got many players that are close to retirement that that choose to retire here in the U.S. Much notably, Lionel Messi, the best player in the world. He's now plays in Inter Miami. We've had other players of that caliber come over here at the end of their career, such as Gareth Bale coming to LAFC, Olivier Giroud also headed to LAFC. But the greater point is that MLS is has it has gained the interest of players who play in Europe, which is only going to help contribute to the rise of MLS and will benefit an increase of soccer culture in the US that's going to help the national team in the long run. However, having noted all those things and having those things in mind, there are still a few problems that I would say need to be fixed if the US wants to truly excel in this sport. Right now, there is probably key problems that are still an issue for the entirety of the US team. I think part of it is that the consistency. I don't think they're consistent enough to the point where they could be seen to a similar skill set of players of national teams from like South America or Europe because, for example, like I mentioned already in the beginning of the show or in the middle of the show, the US was able to give a good performance against England in the 2022 World Cup, held them to a draw. However, literally a few days ago, the US lost against Panama in the Nations League semifinals. And the US has a massive talent gap between Panama And the fact that they were not able to beat them was concerning because the tournament was played in US soil. The US were playing at home, but they managed to lose against Panama. What's worse was that US was the better team on paper. They were the better team on the pitch. Panama only had one shot on target the entire game, and that shot alone was enough for them to score the only goal of that match and send them through to the final in the US. Obviously, that was a massive failure for them. And I do think key performances like that are crucial to be fixed and make sure things like this don't happen if the US wants to truly compete in the next edition of the World Cup, or even just after upon that, if the US wants to truly improve and be a top powerhouse national team in the international realm. They're gonna have to improve and not fail in local tournaments in North America if they want to excel and not lose to teams like Panama. Another interesting thing I would note is the concept of attendances at US matches. Now, there has been an increase in soccer culture, but that doesn't mean like we're at a point where soccer is beloved by all Americans. Every American wants to go see the US play. Obviously, no. There's been an increase, but sometimes it is not reflected in the national team with fans going to the games, because many times when the US team plays either a friendly or matches like this in North American competition, stadiums don't even sell out. Stadiums are empty. And that match I just talked about, the US versus Panama game, there was very, very little people in attendance supporting the US. And I feel the US is going to have to have many fans behind their back supporting them if they truly want to excel. Now, the reason why I say this is because the top tier teams such as Argentina and England have many and loyal fan bases that whenever the team plays, no matter what type of game it is, it could be a friendly, the stadium will always be sold out. And I do think the thing to admire in situations like this is that the fans create a hostile environment against the visiting teams that sometimes gives the home team the advantage. Now, just imagine that the US did that. The US has a large population. Now, if we had many Americans attending the match supporting the US, we could create an atmosphere like that rivals that of Argentina or England that could aid the US and make the rival teams uncomfortable play, which would give the edge to the US so that they could do something and even win those matches. So I think in the upcoming years, even looking to this World Cup, the US is gonna need to find ways to encourage their fans to go and support them whenever the national team plays. But I do think in the World Cup, though, because it's a World Cup, I do think fans are going to go support the US no matter what. But I do think in all types of games, there should be an increase in fans where the stadium doesn't look empty, because that alone is embarrassing for the team. Even in friendly matches, there should be fans supporting them there. Also, another thing that I think affects the US team a lot is a mentality thing. I do think many of these young players with talent aren't quite there when it comes to the mental aspect of wanting to win games, which I do think contributes to the inconsistency aspect that leads them to lose games, for example, against Panama. I do think the US sometimes they might get cocky, they might overlook their opponents. Like in that match that took place against Panama, there's obviously a huge talent gap, but the players probably thought that they had that game in the bag, that they were already in the final. But I think that mentality thing hurt them in the end, as Panama was able to cause the upset and beat them and eliminate them. And I do think they have to get better with mentality if they want to be consistent and try and improve themselves and reach a higher level. But I do think a top tier level coach like Mauricio Pochettino can be the guy that helps these young players mentally, that will then benefit them to get more consistent and positive results that benefits the national team in the long run. As I would say that in the few coming years, maybe even in the World Cup, we might get some few lackluster underperformances from the US. I mean, many people argue that US can cause an upset. I don't really think the US are going to win it. There's too many teams that are way, way better than them right now, such as Argentina, Spain, England, or France, that are just way ahead of the US in terms of talent, in terms of mentality, in terms of everything. But being that they're playing at home, they could be like dark horses in the tournament. Many fans are predicting for the US to pull a dark horse performance and maybe reach quarterfinals at best. I do think that can be a case, but for me, they're probably gonna exit the same round as they did last time in the last World Cup, probably around the 16th exit, depending on the teams they get in the group stage, and even in the knockout games, depending on what rivals they get, they might not even go far considering these performances. But I think looking at the bigger picture, I do think they're headed right now in the right direction. There are a few little minimal things. Well, not minimal, they're probably major, but they need to be handled with in the best way they possibly can so that the US is headed in the right direction. I think right now, I would say they are on track towards being headed to the right direction, but the goals that they want, even the coach himself said that the US is looking big. They want to win the World Cup. And I do think they need to fix very key aspects if they truly want to achieve a goal like that, like win the World Cup. But the rise that they've had has happened in the span of only a few years, and that's really remarkable to look at because what they've done in just a few amount of years for other national teams would take longer, maybe even like 10 years. A whole massive cycle would have to take place, but the US was able to basically improve in such a short span of time, improve drastically. But obviously, they do need something and a little more if they truly want to be considered a top elite level team in the world, such as South American or European teams. And I do think right now they are headed on the right track, but it's only a matter of time before those other differences that I've already discussed get resolved, and we can consider the U.S. to be a powerhouse in the world of soccer. The U.S. produces the best athletes. The U.S. in general, Americans are very competitive. So once things like that start to improve in the national team, and they finalize and get rid of these other issues, the U.S. will compete for a World Cup and be considered a top tier level team. But for what we have now, the US has done a remarkable job. They've done well, they've improved vastly and drastically. And for me, it's admirable to look at it and gets me eager as a fan knowing that the nation has improved massively. And this is a team that Americans can root for and look forward to representing them in important competitions such as the World Cup. So, in this regard, the US has done a great job giving their fans hope and making them look forward to when they get to play. Despite certain problems that are present and to be fixed, everything else has been done pretty well. And that's a wrap. And thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you could tune in and listen to the next episode. Thank you.